Hello, everyone. Today I'll be talking about the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. I'll be informing you guys on how a sweetener flooded the streets of Boston and became very dangerous. First, I will show you guys a quick video. It's crazy how much damage the molasses did. Okay. And so I chose to talk about the Great Molasses Flood of 1919 because it's not a well-known tragedy that's talked about throughout history, and I thought many people would want to listen to what I have to say about it. I've done a lot of research about this tragedy since I've learned about it 2 years ago, and have been through many sources to find the perfect way to explain this whole tragedy. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 isn't well known, and I want to be able to teach you guys about how, why, and what happened to cause the flood. I'll talk about why there was a tank of molasses in Boston and what they used it for before the tank broke. Then I'll talk about the problems with the tank prior to the flood and how the tank exploded and what happened after it broke. Finally, I'll talk about the aftermath of the flood and how it affected the people of Boston. The tank was built in 1915. It was a 2 million gallon tank of molasses that held molasses that was built on Boston's waterfront on Commercial Street. The tank was built by and operated by the Purity Distilling Company, a subsidiary subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol, USIA, as I will be calling it. Molasses was used for industrial alcohol when it was fermented and was highly profitable. The molasses was also used to make ammunition and other weaponry for the soldiers fighting in World War One at the time. Even though the tank was benefiting the higher ups in the USIA, it quickly became a recurring problem. With the tank always leaking and often making rumbling noises, it would scare the citizens nearby in the nearby neighborhood. The tank started to look like it was a failure by the USIA. After the war, even with all the problems, the USIA decided to keep it running. The USIA started focusing more on making grain alcohol, which meant the molasses tank would be used even more than before. Even with the rumbling noises and the constant leaking, the USIA still kept the tank running, which caused a tragedy to occur. At around 12:30 p.m. on January 15th, 1919, the tank burst, releasing 2 million gallons of molasses onto the streets of Boston, Massachusetts. Witnesses of the flood who survived said there was a wave of molasses that was around 20 to 15 feet big and 160 feet wide, coming straight towards them. Many people couldn't get to safety after the burst of the tank because the wave was moving at around 135 miles per hour, destroying everything in its path. The 160-foot wide wave pushed through buildings, cars, and several city blocks. Help arrived as soon as possible, but by the time the rescuers arrived, the molasses had hardened, causing victims to be stuck in the molasses, drowning with no way out. The molasses flood resulted in 21 people dying and over 150 people being injured. The tank exploded and really hurt the community of Boston, but there was still a lot more to be done. After the flood, there were numerous amounts of lawsuits against the USIA that said the tank was unsafe and should have been stopped being used. But then the USIA claimed that it was sabotaged. In 1925, it was ruled that the tank was unsound and the USIA was sued and was ordered to pay all property damage caused by the flood. This also caused the construction codes become a lot stricter so this disaster wouldn't happen again. Many people wondered how something like molasses, which seems pretty unharmful, caused the deaths of 21 people. In 2016, a scientific study showed the cold temperature in Boston was the blame for how people were stuck. The warm weather made the syrup less viscous, while the winter weather caused the molasses to harden, making the molasses very thick and difficult for the rescuers to do anything. The Great Molasses Flood was a horrible tragedy that will thankfully not happen again due to the stricter construction codes. I hope you guys learned something new about the history and had a good time listening to me talk about the Great Molasses Flood. The tank was very helpful for a couple years for a couple years and was very profitable and helped the war out a lot. But and probably could have been used for a much longer time if it was worked on. The tank had many problems that were never talked about, which cost the lives of 21 people and 100 and injured over 150 people. The aftermath ended with the USIA paying for all damages, and it wasn't until 2016 that we figured out how dangerous the molasses was towards the citizens of Boston. The reason to remember this was because it was a huge disaster that caused the death of many people who were forgotten in history and should have never been. I hope you all learned something about the Great Molasses Flood, even if it was through the construction codes being more strict, the ways molasses were used in World War One, or just the fact that there was a molasses flood in the first place. Thank you. This is Jack Murray. Thank you for listening.